Hello, everyone. I think now you are all connected. You are welcome to the first workshop on organized by the SWForum. It is a workshop that is about trustworthy software and open source. It is very good opportunity for us to share ideas on this interesting topic. I don't say good afternoon because I know that there are people all around the world that are connected. So for someone it is already night. For someone else, like our first keynote speaker, is early in the morning. I don't want to take too much time for the presentations. I would like, first of all, today I will be the moderator. I'm Orue-Echevarria from Politecnico di Milano, and I'm one of the two co-chairs of this workshop. First of all, I would like to leave the word to Leire, Orue-Echevarria. She is the coordinator of SWForum, and she will introduce the project, and she will be able to give you some information about this project. Please, Leire.
Yes. Okay, so hello, good afternoon, good morning to everyone participating in the workshop. Thank you for coming in and being with us. Hopefully we can have a fruitful workshop with a lot of discussions. So I will just make a brief pitch of what SWForum is about. So SWForum is an initiative from the European Commission, and we have three main goals. The first goal is to create a sustainable forum of software practitioners that lasts beyond the duration of the project. The second goal is to define the research roadmap in mainly three areas. These are the software technologies, digital infrastructure, and cybersecurity, and hopefully these roadmaps will be able to feed the programs for the next work programs of the European Commission. And the third goal is to prepare Horizon 2020 projects and also Horizon Europe projects that will be funded this year in their approach to the market, and also to understand how mature they are to address the market, and also to address, with respect to their technology. And I would also like to leave the word now to our project officer from the European Commission, Luis, to do the welcome speech. So please, Luis.
Well, thank you very much, Leire. The microphone is moving, so I assume that I'm being heard. Huh? Good afternoon, night, morning to everybody. It's nice actually to have such a constituency spread all over the world. And it is indeed interesting that we can meet all together online in these pandemic moments. I usually would have to say to you, well, sorry, but you have the usual weather of Brussels and you're here, but no, you're in your home countries, in your very nice weather, and there's no problem. Anyway, I have to tell you that one is of those days, very just little small days in the year where we have a pretty nice sun in Brussels, so it wouldn't be a problem here. Cannot deny that I would like to have met you physically, but at least thanks to ICT, we do not need to freeze until we can go out again. And even with the COVID, we can continue our work. What's more, welcome on. Software is something that you do with a computer, and our work is very, very easily done through the ICT way. Actually, we do not have a work in which we could say, come on, if we cannot go to the field, we cannot build something. No, we can do it from home, and we can be connected and work as if we were in no pandemic situation. This workshop, as Leire has said, has been organized under the auspices of SWForum, which is a project financed by the EU Research Framework Program, Horizon 2020. indeed the increased complexity and presence of emerging ICT systems, which include more cybersecurity, which require more integration, are a challenge, not only for the hardware, but also for the software. Seamless connectivity, infinite like power, near infinite also, and data capacity are those things that the user wants to experience and that need to be delivered. And managing this under a high complex and dynamic environment, push continually the development and operation is not easy. And the world is still asking for more trust, for more security, for more reliability, and already processing zettabytes of data. Many stakeholders are active in this domain, and the challenge they face are so powerful that no one alone would actually face. However, the Commission is here to actually to say what to do in a sense, and we understand that there is a relevance and an importance for coordination in the area of software technology, digital infrastructure, and cybersecurity. The objective of SWForum is precisely that, to act as a coordination mechanism for research projects and activities, for disseminating project results, for organizing events like this, and policy events, also roadmaps, innovation roadmaps, and to act as a way to have an embryo of coordination through any people working in software together. The final aim for the Commission after this intervention with the SWForum has to be the creation of a self-sustainable forum that acts without public funding, but actually where stakeholders realize the importance of being coordinated and therefore continue acting after the funding, the EU fund will be finished. And now let's speak about technology and technology roots. We're going to speak about software. Indeed, this project that is financed under the auspices of the Commission concerns software engineering, but let's face it, if we were speaking about software 20 years ago, maybe it would not be that relevant, although it was already there. But nowadays, we cannot speak about software if we do not speak about open source. What's more, the ideology fights and wars that there were 15 years ago concerning open source are not now. At that time, the question was if whether open source was going to be something that completely destroyed the economy to a certain extent or completely transformed it. Well, nowadays, sorry, but with 15 years more of experience, we know that open source is here and is here to stay. And let's see how we can do the most business out of the existence of open source and with open source existing, and how we can internalize the things that are developed by open source communities to make sure that we supply more value to our customers at the same or lower price, or at least lower cost for us, so that we can maximize our profit. These 2 last decades have resulted in, I would say, a gray outcome, a gray in the sense that it's not white or black for open source, because open source has succeeded, but has succeeded in a very different way that was foreseen. Indeed, nowadays, every business in ICT is considering open source for its strategy, and has to think about how can be business made out of it. Let's also face it that open source is now spilling off just the software sector, and now we're speaking about also open source hardware, open science, open silicon, open electronics. The existence of this tool for the humankind, that is the internet, allows actually the possibility to work together to many people that were spread and separated 50 years ago, and now through the internet they have access to billions of humans that can actually collaborate, and they will find out those that will collaborate for the things that they want to develop, and therefore things that were impossible to be done by a single human 50 years ago are now possible because it's a group of humans coordinated for the sake of their common interest. We're indeed living vibrant moments for open source, and I look forward to hearing on the different sessions, especially the first one who has a very interesting name in its own, and also for the next days, because remember that this project is a project for software engineering coordination. There are numerous technology trends that are happening now and that will have a major impact in the development of software. We know about, well, we've spoken about open source, but there is also big data, DevOps, cloud computing, cybersecurity. All these topics represent highly dynamic environment and market segments and key drivers for the innovation. And the Commission takes very seriously having a competitive landscape on the continent. And for that reason, I would like to encourage you to continue working in that direction, and also thank you to work in ICT and in software, which is one of the economic sectors with the biggest economies of scale. Anyway, as prime industrial differentiator and as the basis for a growing range of products and services, software can significantly increase competitiveness. And therefore, we certainly seek to increase Europe's competitiveness to achieve better growth and better welfare. The European Commission is committed to invest in software. And it has done it through the LATE program, through ICT research, and especially through IT-related and new emerging technologies, which are crucial to keep on Europe at the edge, at the cutting edge of technology. Anyway, I don't want to keep you more from working, and therefore I look forward to hearing all the things that will happen during this workshop, and to have a very, very fruitful and intense discussion. So thank you very much in any case, Leire, for inviting me to produce this keynote, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Luis. It was a very interesting introduction. I would like now to leave the floor shortly to Gianfranco, that is going to introduce the online forum that is one of the tools that our project is going to make available to the audience. Please, John.
Thank you very much for this. I would like to get back now to a couple of things that were said by both Leire and by Luis. And that one of the key activities of SWForum.eu is to create an online forum, and which is directed specifically at European software researchers to discuss issues, trends, concerns, in all aspects of software technology, digital infrastructures, and cybersecurity. So here it is. You should be able to see it now on the screen. It's coming on live right in these days now. And as you can see, it's a fully fledged professional forum platform for identifying topical discussion groups, creating user profiles, developing discussion threads, likes, dislikes, upvoting. But what is unique is that it's for us, European software community. And by the way, as Luis said, it's also a unique opportunity for us to make our voices heard by the European policymakers by developing recommendations regarding future directions for software in Europe. So please join the forum, all of you. The link is up here in the right-hand corner of the website. You'll see that you can sign up at both the individual and corporate levels. So we look forward to all of you joining up. Okay, that's all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. Time is running pretty fast. The session is quite dense, so I would like to start introducing immediately the first keynote speaker. If you can start switching on your camera, Tony. So the first keynote speaker is Tony Wasserman. If I want to introduce properly Tony, it would take half an hour, more or less, because his CV is quite long. I know that all of you knows Tony Wasserman is one of the renewed expert on open source software. He is working in he has several, let's say, hats wearing hats as an academic, as an entrepreneur. So would like now, I don't see him.
I'm here.
Oh, here you are. Okay. I didn't see your video. Now I can see you. I leave you the floor, Tony.
Great. Well, thank you very much,
just
everybody.
Summarize your long CV.
Oh, yeah, virtual applause. Yeah, thank you all very much. Don't applaud now. I haven't said anything. So good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here in cyberspace with you. I'm going to share my screen, and let's see if I can get that. Get some slides. There we go. And let's see. Now, if we can make this, I'm having, this always drives me crazy. Just give me a moment. You can see that, but I'm trying to figure out how to go to the next slide. No. All right. Give me a moment. What am I doing? I should be able to, let me do it this way.
So while Tony is going to set up his...
There we go. All right, let's try that. Let us try this.
Okay, great.
Now you got it. All right, so I wish we could be in Milan with my hosts over there. And to our previous speaker, we could be in Brussels. But here we are all joined together in virtual reality. So we'll try to make the best of it and hope that we'll have the opportunity to meet in person before too long. For those of you who just joined, I live in San Francisco and I am at home where it is 8 in the morning or 17 past. So with no further ado, let's just jump in. First of all, I used the title Open Source is Eating the World, but others have used the same phrase, and I really do want to give credit. The first one to use that phrase was Michael Skok, who's a venture capitalist who's invested in open source companies over the years. But all of these people actually borrowed the phrase from Mark Andreessen, who said software is eating the world. And that's something he said about 10 years ago. And he's a general partner in the venture capital firm of Andreessen and Horowitz, as well as being the co-developer of the Mosaic browser back in about 1993 or 1994. Some of you may remember it. One of the key points that we all want to observe about software eating the world is that our modern societies depend on it. Let's face it, we couldn't begin to have a meeting such as this without that software technology and the communication technology. We couldn't travel to see one another very easily without air traffic control and avionics. We couldn't do business without e-commerce and electronic stock purchases, and even hiring because software is used so heavily in resume screening and hiring. So every time we look around, we have to think about how dependent we are. And if you're ever in a situation when the software systems go down, you know that you can't make airline reservations, you can't check into hotels, the traffic lights break, and it becomes really something quite unworkable in a high-tech society. Another thing that happens, at least to me every day, is that I sign on to my iPad or I open up my telephone and there are a whole bunch of app updates. And this is from Saturday. I had 4, and all of them just say, oh, well, here's our daily bug fix. Now, none of these applications are particularly mission critical, maybe Twitter, but that's there. And I got up this morning and I turned on my iPad and there were 11 app updates. So on the one hand, we have these systems that rarely get updated. And on the other hand, we have our modern mobile apps that update with great frequency, often to add new functionality, but even more often to fix a bug. So when we think about reliability and trustworthiness, we have this broad spectrum. But let's face it, we all expect our software to be reliable. Even though we work in it and we see the bugs all the time, and we're always out there trying to fix something, we still have this expectation of reliability when we're the users. We expect the phone calls to go through, or if we order groceries online, as many have done during the pandemic, we expect the right items to be assembled for us and delivered to us and charged properly. If we use medical devices or fitness devices, we expect that accurate heart rate, for example, the platforms that we use, we expect the operating systems to work and to be reliable. We expect all of our productivity tools to work. And of course, we expect security to work when we log into systems, whether it's two-factor authentication or Touch ID or Face ID. I managed to cut my finger, and this one, which of course you use for Touch ID, and you know, my iPad just simply wouldn't recognize me, and I have to type in my password all the time. So, oh well. We also expect our software to be trustworthy. And if you look at what's happened these days recently about software, there was a hack into Microsoft Exchange server. There were automobile crashes caused by the autopilot on Teslas. And I say this, I own a Tesla Model 3, but I did not pay the money for the autopilot. I think that was probably a good decision. We've read a lot about the 737 MAX and its avionics software. We've seen about the SolarWinds problems with that being hacked. And of course, we've seen our cloud and web services systems go down from time to time. So all of those are examples where we would hope to trust the software, but where the software has given us some reason not to do so. So when I think about the word trustworthy, I ask a few questions. The first one is it safe for widespread use? Or is it something that we use just for ourselves or with a small known audience? Do we provide reliable and accurate results? I remember when I first got into computing a long, long time ago, the numerical analysts were having a very difficult time dealing with round-off error because they were trying to compute results to many decimal places on machines that were binary. And you know, when you make those tiny, tiny round-offs on each calculation, they pile up, and pretty soon the results that you get are far from correct. When we say trustworthy, is it secure against hackers and organized attacks? But go beyond that. Will you trust that software enough that you stake your life or that of your family on its reliable operation? That involves getting on airplanes, for example. And do we trust the organizations and people responsible for its development and ongoing maintenance? The aviation authorities in the United States allowed Boeing to check the development and ongoing maintenance of their own control software. And we see what happened there. So now all of us have different levels of risk acceptance and aversion. So you think to yourself, would you fly today on a Boeing 737 MAX using the MCAS software for control? Would you get into a Tesla and turn on the autopilot and sit there and see what happens? Some of you will be glad to do that. Others of you would say, well, maybe not this year. One area that comes up in particular has to do with AI and machine learning. We've gone now from algorithms to heuristics in a lot of areas, autopilot being one of them. And there are a lot of toolkits out there that people are using routinely, TensorFlow and PyTorch to build up machine learning systems and run these applications based on large volumes of data, which may or may not be accurate. We've seen a whole bunch of machine learning failures. Face recognition is one of them. Turns out that the facial recognition systems do very well on white male faces, and they do very poorly on everything else. And particularly people of darker skinned features and women who may change their hairstyles frequently, facial recognition just does very poorly. IBM spent, I think, about $1 billion on Watson and then tried to deploy it for medical diagnosis, and it didn't do very well. And so the places that were trying it out initially gave up on it and went back to traditional mechanisms of diagnosis. We've also seen machine learning fail in hiring algorithms. It turns out that they discriminate. Again, skin color is part of it, but using some of these automated applications for hiring has not worked out well. Part of it, of course, is that the development teams themselves are dominated by white males, and so there's definitely a need for more diversity there. But as we think about trustworthiness, as we build our future applications, these issues do very much come into play. In other words, sometimes the software gets indigestion while it's trying to eat the world. Now, I haven't said anything yet about open source, so maybe we should do that, because the question is how free and open source software fits into the picture that I've laid out. Is it reliable? Is it trustworthy? Is it secure? And how does it compare to traditional proprietary software in those respects? Is open source eating the world in the same way that other software is? So when I say that open source is eating the world, what I mean, of course, is that first, businesses and organizations are evaluating both proprietary and open source side by side. It used to be that you'd have people who only looked at open source or people who only looked at proprietary software. And so the people in that latter group wouldn't even consider open source alternatives. But now we live in a world where people look more broadly, and sometimes the best solutions lie in one camp, and sometimes they lie in the other. But we've seen that the total cost of FOSS is traditionally lower. And there's a lot of data that shows that the quality is comparable in terms of the number of errors there are per 1,000 lines of code, for example. And we see that for a whole lot of open source systems, there's commercial support and training available, sometimes from the company that exists to develop that software, sometimes from a company that's grown up and provides support for open source software. So companies that are building software systems now are routinely including it in their products. And a lot of the new technology that we're seeing around large data management, around machine learning, containerization, it's de facto open source. The leading products are open source, and they represent the best and most up-to-date choices. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I do want to point out that there are different kinds of free and open source software. For a long time, we thought about community-based open source software, and the image of that, of course, was young men with maybe a lot of hair, and they wore t-shirts, and you would send in clean t-shirts to their bedrooms or their basements now and then, and they would eat a lot of pizza. But that's an old view of it, and what we see today is that most of the widely used open source projects either come from a foundation like Apache or Eclipse, or they come from companies that have grown up specifically to develop and profit from that open source software, not by selling the software, but by selling services, or sometimes having dual licenses where there's a community version that's free forever for anyone, and then a commercially licensed version that gets used in commercial products. So there are some differences in the way these get built and maintained, but we're not going to delve into that here. I can make a very long list of open source products that are widely used. I just want to point to a couple of them. Linux, of course, and if you look at all the servers running software in the world, about 45% of them are running an open source Linux operating system, with Red Hat Enterprise Linux having the largest share. For a long time, Apache's HTTP server had a majority of all websites. Now they and Nginx are about even, and Windows Server has the rest. Android runs about 3/4 of all mobile phones. WordPress is 40% of all websites. I was just amazed to see that number, how widely used it is across all websites, not just across blogs or content management. And we can go through more of these. But the fact is that almost everybody encounters open source products. You may be using it without knowing that you're using it. You go to websites and they're built on open source typically. So there's a company here in the US called Synopsys, and a lot of their business involves analyzing commercial applications. And every year they go around and do a study of proprietary applications. They did one last year on open source security and risk analysis. They also did one on DevSecOps practices and open source management. And they produced their results that you can download and look at. For the open source security one, they looked at over 1,000 audited applications across a bunch of different industries. And one thing that they concluded that really struck me was that 99% of the code bases they analyzed contained open source software. Now, maybe some of the organizations in that 99% had open source software in their code and didn't know it was there because they were using some component, and that component in turn used open source software. But it's really an amazing percentage, and it talks about the universality of open source software. At the same time, when they looked at that code, they found that many of them had high-risk vulnerabilities, that the code failed certain static tests, or that there were loopholes of various sorts. Also, if there was more than one kind of open source software, maybe there were license conflicts, so that you had MIT license code combined with GPL code and things like that. Again, if you go look at the Synopsys open source software and risk analysis report, you can see more of that. The security report, and I know that one of the other speakers is going to go into this whole DevSecOps topic in more detail, but the number that I want you to take away from this slide is that only 34 or 37% of development organizations are using these security tools. The numbers tend to be very, very low. And as a result, they're vulnerable to various security problems. So this is, I think, a major point to notice that as we try to build trustworthy software, we need to rely on the organizations developing it to be more thorough in the way that they use their security tools. We could go on again for a long time about development processes, and there are some people who are really, really strong believers in formal development processes, people who grew up with, for example, the Software Engineering Institute's capability and maturity models. I'm not one of those people. I believe that having some development process is better than none, but I've seen great systems built using the superhero model, and I've also seen some good systems built in other ways. There are a lot of factors that go into what makes for a good piece of software, and to me, having some visibility that some of the methods like Agile and Scrum give you some insight. It's helpful. You can see how things are going. You can check on it thoroughly, but relying entirely on the process is not going to always get you where you need to go. The other thing that I think is worth noting about development processes is that they've begun to integrate continuous integration and continuous development and have tools to do so. And what that allows them to do is permit multiple releases on any given day. Some companies are actually proud about the frequency with which they can release software. And of course, if you're releasing that frequently, you can't do as much testing as you would like. You're just putting it out there and seeing what happens, either on a subset of your sites or letting some subset of your users test it out. So that's an area that I think bears further attention as we look for trustworthiness. One other area that is growing up very quickly as open source gets more and more adopted is that organizations are beginning to manage it. For a long time, companies had chief information officers, and those people were responsible for software acquisition and for the business dealings with software vendors and keeping track of the number of licenses. But that becomes hard to do in a world where developers can download open source software that they want to use. People can use open source browsers or blogging tools or the like. So what we're seeing grow up are open source project offices, and they're responsible for establishing open source strategy within the company. They keep track of what FOSS software is being used and making sure that they're compliant with it. And ideally, as they become more mature in their use of open source, they engage with the developer community, they contribute code back to projects. Oracle, for example, did a lot of work on clustering for some of the open source database management systems, and that was a really significant contribution some years ago. There's a group that works under the auspices of the Linux Foundation now called the To-Do Group, and they've produced a series of guides about open source. And this there's one guide that talks about how to manage open source program offices. So I don't want to go too much longer. I want to leave time for some questions, but a couple of takeaways. First of all, my point is that FOSS is not just mainstream, but really almost universal. And to keep track of it, we need this kind of organizational governance. Trustworthiness is independent of proprietary versus open source code. Most of the examples I gave you of trustworthiness issues in the earlier part of my talk were independent of proprietary versus open source. The same issues arise no matter what the code is. And then I do want to again emphasize that issue of security testing and the need for analysis to identify vulnerabilities in code before deployment. Well, there's a lot more that we could talk about, and we could talk about these takeaways indefinitely, but I think this is probably a good point for me to show you San Francisco in the background there, and there's an email address that reaches me. There's a Twitter handle, and down at the bottom is a link to my photo gallery on Flickr. It's reasonably well organized into albums. There are about 6,000 photos there of all of the places we've talked about. So let me stop there. I'll stop sharing my screen, and we have some time, I hope, for a few questions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Tony. A virtual applause, let's say. It was a very, very nice keynote, introducing most of the main relevant aspects of open source software in terms of trustworthiness. I don't know, Julia, if she's managing the questions. I invite all the audience that would like to submit any questions to the presenters to write on the chat.
Okay, so I have a chat window open, and also people can feel free to just ask directly. I think we're actually past our end time, aren't we? So maybe we don't have much time for questions.
No, don't worry. I think we have time for one question.
Well, if nobody wants to ask a question, I have something that is half of a comment. You were talking about the development process and how you should add some of it, but you should not get too much of it. I've been involved in automotive safety, and they came up with a standard for that about 10 years ago, which involved both auditing of the process and other technical things. When they did the second version of that standard about 2 years ago, they had to completely redo it because the auditors have been limiting themselves to only looking at the process, and they had stopped looking at what the program really did. They have been making it easy on themselves by just looking at the process. So your points are well taken about the process problem.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, you can have a process which is all pencil and paper with people who are poorly educated, and they can go execute the process, but it's not going to work. You'll do much better with an appropriate set of tools and some people who actually know what they're doing, even if they're not following a very well organized and structured process.
Okay, thank you very much. We need to move to the next presentation. I invite all the speakers to stay with us because at the end we have a question and answer session. If you would like to participate, it would be really appreciated. I would like to move to the second keynote speaker. He is Matthias Eckermann. He's head of product management Linux platform at SUSE. I think that all of us knows SUSE. Also in his case, I don't want to steal too much time presenting him, introducing him. I think it is a pleasure to have him as a keynote speaker in our workshop. And if you're ready, Matthias.
I'm ready. Do you understand me?
Yep.
Okay.
I leave you the floor.
Good. Some of you may have recognized these three icons here. And these three icons define the context of what I would like to talk about. Now let's go into what it is. The first logo is the open source initiative that defines what really an open source license is. The second logo is the representation of the European Sovereignty Initiative, which goes beyond software, but digital sovereignty is part of it. And the third logo is a little bit of, well, me being European and buying food from all over Europe. It's the protected designation of origin logo for stuff like cheese or olive oil, which you find all over the place and where you really see where things come from. And this, for me, represents part of the quality and also the supply chain topic that I would like to discuss today. When we are talking about a software supply chain, obviously it doesn't make sense to talk about food. So let's talk about a supply chain in software development and use the DevOps logo for it. I will come back to that later. When we look at these logos, then all the three areas that we are discussing about, open source, sovereignty, and supply chain, overlap to a certain degree. And the overlap of these things, this really is the question of my discussion and my short keynote today. I would like to talk about open source as the basis for a secure software supply chain. And my name is Matthias Eckermann. I'm head of product management for the Linux platform at SUSE, a German open source company, actually the oldest commercial Linux vendor and the leader in SAP. I'm working in the open source area for 30 years, 25 years with Linux, and over 20 years at SUSE. I will look into the topic that we want to discuss today in 3 steps. First, talking about digital sovereignty very quickly. Then second, talking about open source, also very briefly. And then a little bit broader about the secure software supply chain. What does it mean? Which components do we have to consider? And which tools, I only will bring 3 or 4, are we looking at when we, as examples, when we are discussing a secure software supply chain, and what can we learn from this? So let's look into digital sovereignty as the first step. When we are looking at digital sovereignty, it not only is software, as we already heard, but it is also hardware. It even includes the infrastructure that we are talking about. Certainly also the software, but this is a correspondence, right? Software depends on hardware, and you can never have full digital sovereignty without also having a certain degree of control over the hardware. Software, though, is not everything. We just discussed and heard about the safety process. So algorithms and processes, to own these, to control these, to define those, and to have an insight into is part of digital sovereignty as well. But that's not the end. We always need to consider that to invest into things, we also need to make money with it. So the question about digital sovereignty doesn't end at the software level. It doesn't end at the process level, but we also need to consider which business models can we build around the digital world and the digitalization. And this is something where I think Europe has to learn something and probably also to invest and invent something. The biggest concern, specifically here in Germany, I'm living in Potsdam, by the way, is the question of data sovereignty. What is done with my data is the question. But it doesn't stop at the personal level, at the human level. The question also applies to companies. What does happen with my data when I use this specific software, this specific service, when I'm deploying my infrastructure on premise or in the cloud? This is a valid question, and it is also a question of digital sovereignty. Enough about sovereignty. Let's talk about open source. I already talked about the open source initiative, who define the open source licenses and the validity of an open source license according to 10 criteria in 6 groups. So let's look into these 6 groups. The first and the most obvious one is the free redistribution. So whatever you get as open source software, you are able to redistribute, but you also have to give others the right to redistribute. This obviously requires that you have access to the source code, that you can change the source code, and you can publish what is called derived work of the source code. However, this derivation of the source code also has some impact on the author of the original source code. It needs to be made sure that you can distinguish between the original author and someone who produced a derived work, so that the application of a specific good thing or a specific fault or mistake can be done correctly. This is defining the code, also the binaries that can be given away. But there is more to it than just the, let's say, technical part. With the author, we already have discussed a little bit of the human factors, and we also have touched the legal factors a little bit. So the human factors, one of the human factors we need to look into open source is non-discrimination. And this is not only about race or religion, but this is also about that true open source software should not limit the user or the receiver of a specific piece of software from doing with that whatever he or she wants. This means the business should not be limited with respect to the open source software. It's called the discrimination against a field of endeavor. This will play a role later on in our comparison at the end. And finally, there are 4 more specific rules around the license requirements and the terms of the licenses. That's not so interesting for people who are not lawyers, but nevertheless, it needs to be considered when we are discussing open source software. My third point, a secure software supply chain. Let's start with a definition. A secure software supply chain is the ability to secure, document, and trace sources and binaries, built environment and update mechanisms of a specific workload over its full life cycle. But why do we care? We care because we as human beings are eager about trust and control. And those are 2 pairs. It's trust into machines or mistrust. It's trust or mistrust on processes or the wish to have control over those. It's trust or mistrust in businesses. It's trust into human beings, mistrust into human beings, and potentially even the wish to have control over those. And as I already indicated when we discussed digital sovereignty, it definitely is, and specifically over here, about data, about the trust into the data that you're using, and about the attempt to have control over the data that is important to you as a human being or as a business. So we can expand our definition of secure software supply chain. It's the ability to secure, document, and trace sources and binaries, built environment, and update mechanisms of a specific workload over its full life cycle, to gain trust into and keep control over machines, processes, businesses, human beings, and data. When I introduced the logo, I already indicated that I've chosen to use the DevOps cycle as the template for the software lifecycle when discussing a secure software supply chain. And I would like to go through the steps of this DevOps lifecycle or this DevOps cycle in the context of a secure software supply chain, even if what I'm saying also applies to software which is not developed following a DevOps model. The reason is that a truly secure software supply chain requires an end-to-end knowledge about the software, yet not an endless knowledge though. So let's look into the first stages. When we talk about planning and coding, then we are talking about integrity of the code base, for example. But we are also talking about authenticity, about where a specific idea or where a specific code comes from. We talk about accountability of a specific step in the software, of a specific piece of code in the software to a human being or a group. That's the one part. The other part, though, is that if we are using such a software, we also need to consider the availability of this software, the resilience of this software, or where it is stored, how it is treated against unwanted change, against fraud, or similar things. And one of the topics I feel is sometimes a little bit forgotten is that with all these things, and also the topic of availability, we have to consider the life cycle. What happens if a specific code repository goes down? If a specific maintainer of a code that I am using is not available any longer? If he stops maintaining the code, and then potentially nobody has access to the specific source code, or at least cannot change it? Or even worse, what if someone takes over, let's say, a Git repository, which is public, and sneaks in code that I really didn't want to see in my project? This is part of integrity, authenticity, accountability, but also lifecycle, and should not be forgotten. Next step in the software life is build and test. Here we have to make sure that the integrity of the whole environment where build and test happen is considered safe, good for what I want to be. I need to be able, and I want to be able to look into it. The confidentiality of specific steps might be relevant even in an open source context. Let's think about 0 days that potentially might be published or that are discussed in specific teams and should not make it to the public before the so-called coordinated release date. Again, it is also about the resilience and availability. And one of the topics that is really discussed in the Debian community, in the OpenSUSE community, so our community and others, is the topic of reproducible builds. Can I, at any point in time, also in the future, create exactly the binary that I created 20 years ago? And will it meet the same quality criteria that it met back then? Think about that. IoT and Edge will make us face a 20 to 25 years life cycle of open source software around the world. When we release, we have to consider the authenticity and non-repudiation requirements, and those need to be secured. They need to be traced. Digital signatures nowadays are fortunately, at least in most of the open source world and most of the software world, even state of the art. But still, there are some people who mean and think that this is not really necessary. Again, when we have a release process, we need to think about availability and scalability of this release so that we can support everybody when he or she deploys the specific software. And the person who deploys wants to do the opposite. They want to verify the authenticity and integrity of what has been delivered, because they need to declare compliance towards their organizations and have to then sign off on this compliance. The same is true for the maintenance part. Here, they need to trust on a committed life cycle where they get security fixes, or, and here commercial software vendors, even in an open source world, come in, we have to talk about committed support agreements on a specific piece of code that someone delivers. Certainly, any organization can organize that themselves. Most, though, may want to reach out to commercial support and services around open source software. After this run through the world of a secure software supply chain, let me come to 4 example initiatives that I find interesting, who really highlight that people think about different aspects. Number 1 certainly is Git and all the diverse repositories that we find out in the world. You know that Git is kind of the younger brother of Linux, also invented by Linus and the kernel team. In Germany, as a response to the availability of many repositories, which though are not really owned by anybody or where the ownership is unclear, the Open Source Business Alliance has started an initiative called Ein Ort für öffentlichen Code. That means a place for code in the public or code produced by the public, meaning that it is an initiative to drive more open source development within the German government and the government also of the German states and cities. This is something where I think the US are already a huge step ahead, but still it is a good initiative that is currently going on. The Linux Foundation worldwide has started an open source software supply chain security track. And from a SUSE perspective, there is one open source software that I am very proud about because it is the heart of what we are doing. The so-called open build service delivers all the software that SUSE is providing. It is the softwareized or process and knowledge that our engineers have put forward. Around 100 users and companies worldwide are using this. They're on premises. You can install it and download. It builds from sources and outputs whatever you can imagine. Packages for all different Linux distributions, containers, ISO images for installation. It builds on all architectures that I can imagine it to be available on. And certainly it also stores all assets. It's the heart of what we do with respect to the life cycle of our products. And also the OpenSUSE community uses the very same thing and can access all the assets. And actually, the reproducible build functionality is one that is heavily developed here, and then also with the colleagues from the Debian community who are not using the open build service. The benefits are that everybody has full visibility in how we build and how we maintain our software. It enables the community and even more communities than just the OpenSUSE community to build and maintain software. And it enables and enforces process. Not everybody may like this, but this toolified production process has some value because it forces people into a specific mindset of a long-term viability. And that in the end means for us as a company that we can build our certifications on top of it. But it also means for the communities who are using it and for the other companies using it, trust into what they do and how they do it. Let me recap. Secure software supply chain means the ability to secure, document, and trace sources and binaries, build environment and update mechanisms of a specific workload over its full life cycle, to gain and keep trust into machines, processes, businesses, human beings, and data. I've said that my keynote is about the universe of 3 topics. open source, the secure software supply chain, and digital sovereignty. So let's bring the three topics that we have discussed together. Sovereignty asks for the software. Open source delivers free distribution, source code, guarantees derived work, and the integrity of an author's source code. In the secure software supply chain, this is reflected by the need for resilience, integrity, authenticity, accountability, and availability. Digital sovereignty needs business models so that it is sustainable. This actually is also supported by open source software because it allows to deliver and produce derived work. It has the notion of non-discrimination also for the specific business or vertical that you are working in. And open source software also helps with the life cycle aspect of a secure software supply chain. Digital sovereignty asks for control and insight into what happens to your data. When using open source software, via the source code, you know what a specific software does with your data. One of the examples here would be the German Corona app, which actually is in open source and thus gained much more trust than if it would have been closed source. So the data is the really important thing for businesses and for people. And the secure software supply chain, if you apply it to the open source software, helps with that, because due to the reproducible build and the confidentiality that your request for specific steps, but you make open which part is confidential and why, this helps to really build the trust into the software that can be used. And with this, I would like to end with a call to action. Also 3 topics as Tony had. Number 1 is, please go ahead, validate your software supply chains. It is really important. There is extremely good software out there. There are a huge number of valid and secure software supply chains out there in the world, but there are also some things, even in open source, that needs a reconsideration. Help to enhance and enforce the end-to-end trust that we all need to get a better digital life and digital business. And consider and contribute to open source for your work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Big applause, virtual big applause also to you. We have already one question from the audience, from Alan. He's saying, agree, all good points, but we can also prioritize the development and delivery approach if some elements are more important than others. For example, with CI/CD is technically possible, it may not always be desirable in every event if it affects trustworthiness. It needs to be intelligently applied.
Is that in the chat?
No, I can send to you.
Not
okay.
to everyone if it is.
But yeah, feel free to
Okay.
Alan?
Yeah, some of it is. It was just making the point about how we might prioritize things. There are a lot of technical possibilities when you develop things and a lot of different ways of developing things. But if we want to prioritize trustworthiness and reliability, amongst other things, we might need to make certain choices about the development approach we take.
Yes.
But just because things are possible, we might not necessarily want to do them in all circumstances. That was the main point.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And I did not, I just had picked 4 examples of specific technologies that have a specific notion of a secure software supply chain. I didn't mention that. I apologize for Git, for example, because Git has the digitally signed hashes in the tree. Basically, even if not everybody says that, Git is kind of a blockchain underlying technology, at least. So this is why, but you don't have to use it. Certainly, I think at any point in time in a secure software supply chain, you can make choices and still be within such a supply chain. The notion of a specific technology is not given there. It's just that the mindset is there. What you are that you need to apply all these steps to really have a fully secure software supply chain. How you do that is a completely different question from my perspective, indeed.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Alan, are you satisfied?
Yeah, I think Tony made a good point earlier when he was talking about the fact that when you turn on any device now, you're attacked by between 10 and 20 updates. Some of the updates may be very important, some of them might be very trivial, but it's become, I think, almost a default in that that's the way development proceeds. You have to do updates. Maybe when we think about trustworthiness in software, we need to just stand back a bit and think, how does the need to do updates sits with the need to make things reliable and trustworthy?
Yeah, I would agree. However, well, I think the update mechanism is something that you need to consider. My personal biggest concern in this context is that we don't consider the life cycle of things that we do today. As I said during my presentation, if we are talking about edge and IoT or even IIoT devices, we need to consider 15, 20 years of a life cycle of the software we are doing. And we need to consider that we, at some point in time, an update is due for whatever reason, security standards broken, or a specific piece of software found broken, or whatever, right? So that actually is for me a concern. And I think it was John who works in the safety area. That opens a completely new field. If you combine open source with safety, it gets really tricky.
Thank you. There is time for a very short question from David Wallon. David?
Yeah, so I suppose my question is actually around the suitability. You mentioned, Matthias, right at the end about the fact about contributing. And I suppose my question is, how appropriate some of these mechanisms are where software is so ubiquitous, where the vast majority of people don't want to contribute. They just want stuff to work. And, and it wouldn't be appropriate for them to contribute. How we balance that in terms of, the supply of software as for products that are just there, compared to the supply of software, particularly for communities, and developers themselves. So the end user developer balance, I suppose I'd say.
Yes, so that's the perfect question for a product manager as the last question, right? Because as product managers, we see our life, the right to live, actually, in exactly this interface between an end customer and a developer. And I think even in communities, so not necessarily only in companies such as ours, you have people who are working as product managers, even if they are not called that way, who are interfacing between the end user and the developers in the field. And this has always been the case. While in the beginning of open source software, I would say, I said 30 years in it, more people were working for their own purposes on the open source software, while more and more with the broader use of open source software, the need for the separation into functions not only happened in companies, but also happened in the communities. And I do not think that this is a bad thing per se. As companies or as well-funded communities or foundations, it is possible that you are creating those functions, that you are creating the right tools, the right processes, and then help those people who do not contribute with code to contribute with ideas, to contribute with documentation, to contribute with spreading the word, so with marketing, or just to contribute by using it. That's also a contribution from an open source perspective. So that would be my answer to that. But good point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Thank you for the audience for the nice questions. Before moving to the next presentation, I would like to inform you that John has published an URL on the chat. It is a URL for accessing to a survey. We are inviting you to have a look to the survey because it is very interesting for us to collect inputs for experience and needs to create the landscape reports that is fundamental in our work for the SWForum. So please have a look and complete the survey in these days, and not immediately, because now it is time for the last presentation. We move from the keynote speakers to the papers that has been submitted to the workshop. In addition to this keynotes, we have also a set of papers, one today and the rest in the next 2 days. Papers that has been submitted and revised by a set of people, members of the program, the members of the program committee. I take the advantage to say thank you for the people that has been involved in this review, in these reviews for their very nice work. The paper is titled "The Role of Government in Offering Trustworthy Open Source to Citizens." This is a work submitted by Gianfranco, Cecconi, and Esther Huyer. I hope I pronounce it correctly. I think that Gianfranco is going to present it, right?
Can you hear me well, Pierluigi?
Yeah.
And can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Perfect.
So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pierluigi. A premise, first of all, we come from an alternative universe that is the one of open data. And the premise for us coming to you and offering this, a bit of a provocation of an idea. This is not really about us. We work for European Union on a project that has been running for many years called the European Data Portal. And since the very start, Esther and me, part of the team, we've been wondering, okay, there's so much effort being spent on open data by the Commission, but what about open software and open source? So the intuition was, let's try looking through the mirror and see if the parallels work, and can we actually learn anything from the experience that we developed over 6 years that we can offer to the open source community, particularly with relation to trustworthy software. And I want to make it very clear that we are not here to close the conversation. We are here just to open it. And we are perfectly aware that, I'm Italian, by the way, I could talk for a very long time and I only have 10 minutes. So not a 5 pages paper can solve this topic. However, we believe that we could give you ideas and perhaps ways to explore to even improve further the current status of trustworthy software in Europe. So in this about 10 minutes, I will tell you why we think we are entitled to share our experience and the experience of the European Open Data Portal. We will create that kind of parallel through the glass of what we see working on our side of open data that could perhaps be reused on yours. And finally, we'll make an argument for perhaps an extra action that would be very welcome by the Commission in the space of open source. So just for clarity, what's this open data thing anyway? So it's not open source, of course. It's data that anybody can reuse and build upon, usually for free, with little or no constraints, if not the fact itself that you need to attribute where the data comes from. Think of an MIT license for data. And actually, if you read the MIT license, you may actually use it for data as well. And one extra difference with open source software is that most of open data does not come from either the communities or the companies or foundations, but actually comes from governments. That's possibly one difference, not something that accumulates us. And governments sit on large capital of open data, data produced through operations of government, taxpayers' money, and it's just there to be used. And the roots of this data and the commitment from the European Union to it are very, very deep. I mean, the very first piece of law, not even just a strategy or an intention, a piece of law promoting the member states to give this data back to their people is as old as 2003. And because one directive was not enough, there were 3 different ones over time that every time reiterated the message, made it stronger. And the last one was actually from 2019 and comes into force this summer. And because that was not even enough, there will be more. There are 3 different pieces of law on the horizon. Digital Markets Act, Digital Services Act, Data Governance Act, all of these having implications, refining the intention of Europe in the space of the data coming from governments back to their citizens. And because a piece of law was not enough, Europe also gave the job to people like us, for example, to help the member states making this real. So since 2015, the European Data Portal has been around providing a central point of discovery for all of these data made available by the nations, but also providing support to the member states. So we work with them. So we know the kind of experience they've had, difficulty, friction, achievements in getting this data out. And of course, educating citizens, informing them that this amazing resource is available. And perhaps with open source software, today everybody knows about it. But the open data movement, let's say, is younger, about 10 years. I would put my finger in the air about it. Now, how do you help them? And that is, I promised, the last slide describing who we are. What Europe created is something called the European Data Portal. It's not what the name would suggest, like a GitHub for open data. Nothing like that. It is usually the actual sources of data that publish it. What we are is simply a discovery tool, cross-national, which on the side also provide those elements of support and education and training and information that the citizens and the member states need to be successful. We engage with the public, we develop original research, we try to document why open data is valuable, in the same way probably the open source movement has been doing for a very long time, and researchers in academia and so on. Now, as much as the worlds are different, we believe that through the glass we could see analogies, particularly focusing on trustworthiness. And again, I come to you very humbly. I don't think I'm going to convince any of you in a few minutes, but we strongly invite you to read the paper. I will tell you where to find it later. So we tackled 7 dimensions specific to open source software, and we wondered, okay, what is it that we can see that is equivalent or similar in our space, the one of open data, that we can offer back to you? And in this talk, I will only be talking about a few of them, these 3. simply as an example of what you will find in the paper. And then you will be able to argue with me after this presentation at some point. But let's start. So the first one is correctness. So in a software, and I guess I'm not going to teach you anything here, and forgive me if the summary is wild, but most of correctness is simply assessed deterministically through testing. You create a test case, you know the software should behave in a certain way. In data, you can do that. The correctness of data is in the eyes of the beholder in a way. And what you will see working with us or simply talking to us is that in most cases, there is an expectation of correctness that actually comes directly from the relevance of the reuse of the data itself. If reusers, if citizens out there will see that some piece of data is used by governments themselves for their own operations, for policy making, for deciding the parameters of a certain piece of law, then they will trust you that possibly that data is probably better than anything else in the same space available. And I'm not saying that data will be amazing like software. There is a lot of bad stuff out there, unreliable and so on, you say it, but relevant reuse will witness the validity of, and in this case, the correctness of a piece of data. And what you learn from that is the obvious way, perhaps. When governments also create software, when governments fund the development of software, it would be just the natural thing for them to do. And again, I'm saying the obvious here, that they reuse it directly, creating then that kind of implicit guarantee of quality. With all of the wide software being produced by government or funded by government, the fact that this is not returned back to citizens and it's not publicized that those softwares are used in government is a bit of a crime if you think about it. How many opportunities are we missing there? The second of these three, compliance. So we're coming from a European perspective. So it's a very wide environment, and enforcing standards across all of Europe is unfortunately inefficient. I'm going to be provocative here. It's very inefficient, very expensive. Most of us do not have any strong power to enforce compliance. So what do we do? I can tell you what we do in data. We use fewer sticks and more carrots. Focus goes not necessarily on enforcing standards, but more incentivizing them. And we also have realized that what is really important in such a wide environment is that the effort is spent on discoverability. It's not about the software being perfectly ticking all boxes of the compliance terms being defined by someone in an ivory tower, but at least we can make that valuable pieces of software, those data in our case, discoverable. Users must be able to find out that a suitable piece of software or data is available to them, and they can use it and they can explore it for themselves. Discoverability is the word. The last example from the paper of 7 is performance. And again, by the way, I was an engineer. I was a software engineer when I was younger, and I'm still getting used to the idea that I call a software performing when it is fast, when it is scalable and so on. In data, there's some degree of that, but in the end, we realized over the last few years that what really makes a difference in data are indicators such as the impact. It sounds a bit of a fluffy word, but what we refer to is the socioeconomic impact of the availability of some data describing something. The data may be bad, the data format may be not particularly elegant, we may be talking about PDF files, completely unusable. But if that PDF file can change someone's life, if you can build a service on top of it, if you can make politicians accountable, if you can start a new company, then that data set has created an impact. And I may not care if it scales much or if it needs a lot of data scientist work to clean it up. It has made a change. And one suggestion for us in this space is to do the same. And we understand from talking to some of the reviewers of the paper before today that there is a move towards this space as well. This is not a new topic to you. I just insist that perhaps we do it more often. So if you bring the analogy together, if you trust us on the fact that these parallels exist and are credible, after everything we've seen on the European Commission commitment to open data, it's just natural that we wonder, why haven't we seen the same for open source software? Governments own and fund so much software that should naturally be there, discoverable, findable, and reused by each of us. And I don't know to what degree today Europe is doing enough in this space, as much as it does for data. So it's perhaps even obvious for me to say that the times are mature for what we may call a European software portal, a place I go to and I find out which country perhaps has developed a piece of software for solving this problem, a forum where I can argue about it, find more about it, discover who others are reusing the same, hence creating that expectation of credibility and reliability and so on. Again, 10 minutes only. I hope I'm in time. Perhaps I've been even faster than planned, but the argument opens here. I strongly invite you to read what we wrote humbly, just 5 pages. It's going to take only a few minutes to you, and you find that URL now if you like. And of course, you're very, very welcome to get back to us and tell us what you think. The European Data Portal will change soon, brand will change name, but it's going to stick around for another 6 years. I truly hope that in a few years' time, we'll also be seeing an European software portal just on the side, complementing this offering and the support that the Commission does for the community. And I believe this is all for me, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Gianfranco and Esther, that I saw her in the behind the scene, for your nice work and for your how you defended your work. It was really, really nice. Thanks a lot. I don't know if there are questions directly to this work. I don't know if Gianfranco can read the question.
Yeah. So there's a question from Tuka. How to briefly argue against the naive view that open data is something that the government provides, but open source is something that the market provides. It's an interesting question. I also see Luis Carlos must have an opinion on this point. I believe that some of the elements that perhaps prevented a European software portal to be created is some degree of competition. So it's difficult for Europe to enter a market that is much stronger than for data. Luis, perhaps, do you want to take it from here? I believe you may.
Well, I wanted to say something. Actually, I'm seeing that you're a maker, which is really interesting. Anyway, what I wanted to tell you is that place on open source that is discoverable and produced by open source by administration already exists, which is the Open Source Observatory. To a certain extent, I have put the link actually there, and it's around 10 years that it's producing. What is certainly true is that from what you say, the level of spread and use in Europe maybe not enough. I mean that there should be some way actually to make it exist not only virtually, but also to make it exist in the minds of all software producers in the EU, which certainly is something that it does not seem to be the case. And in that sense, what would you think that would be the adequate strategy to bring the open source observatory to the first stage of usage by the all governments, all public administrations in Europe?
There are probably 2 leverages that you can use, and probably the same that your colleagues in DG Connect have used before. That is, on one side, legislative support. So open data for Europe is the law of the land. It's not an option. Governments need to publish, unless of course it's confidential or contains intellectual property that cannot be released under that kind of shape. But that already is sufficient, though not necessary, element of unleashing the data. It unleashes the budget. It allows civil servants across Europe to say, even if I don't really believe in it, you know what? Using the directive, I can get my bosses to create the opportunity for making this happen. The second element is what today probably characterizes the European Data Portal work more than the portal itself. We are actually changing name. I cannot tell you the new one to spoil the surprise, but we are dropping the portal name. And to tell you the truth, it has been misleading for many years. You think of European Data Portal, you just think to a portal you go to find and discover the stuff. In reality, today, the work we do to support the member states, the publishers in this case, has become more and more important. Technology in a way is the least of the problem. Publishing, putting data out is the least of the problem. Same as in open source. I mean, GitHub, GitLab, how easy it is to publish software today. But persuading, educating, training civil servants to recognize that they have a software asset in their hand they can get out and others can reuse, that's the difficult challenge today, I believe, in the same way it is for data. And you also need to help them win all of that kind of friction you also find in data. For example, privacy. In data, they will wonder, what if this data includes personal information and I may put someone in trouble? In software, they may say, what if they sue me because we issue this piece of software and it's not reliable enough, it causes damage? In many cases, in our opinion, this is just a matter of education missing. It's just a matter of support not being given to the member states. When you can fill up that need for support, then you have your answer there, in my opinion. And I truly hope that your team, Luis Carlos, and the others in DG Connect working in software may actually pick that suggestion and try to move in that direction as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it is time to have the final discussion. We are a little bit late behind the schedule. We're supposed to close at 45, if you don't mind. Before moving to the final query and answer session, I would like to remind you that all the slides will be available on the event website, also for the keynote speakers, and the registration of the event will be available on YouTube, I think, and the others will be published on the event webpage. I now would like to leave the floor to Alan Lewis that has a question for Tony. Alan?
Yeah, just turn my camera on. I think the question you're referring to was the one about framework for warranties and indemnities, or are you referring to the earlier question I raised?
You choose. You put a question on the chat right after the talk.
Okay, yeah. So it was the question about reliability and trustworthiness, and whether or not you need to balance these things. I think in your talk, Tony, you said that devices that you tend to use tend to get many updates quite frequently, and although we've got technology to deliver these updates, you need to make a choice about whether delivering them is actually necessarily the best thing to do, given that your objectives might be to make your software as trustworthy as possible and reliable as possible, and there are limitations in your ability to test things. So it's a question about how you prioritize things, really, in doing that.
Well, I think people are going to make their own choices. One of the in the before times, we had the idea that vendors would release updates to their product every now and then. And then one of the struggles that they had with perpetual licenses and software being installed on the customer's own servers is that the customers wouldn't update the software because they would say, well, we know that this works, and if it's not seriously broken, then we're not going to fix it. And what we see in modern applications is that they're very often built on a large number of different open source components, and open source components get updated with amazing frequency. In fact, you can go to almost any one of these open source repositories and download last night's updates. And you can choose to work with the stable version, or you can choose to live on the bleeding edge and say, well, I want the latest and greatest. And I think that the criticality of the application and the risk acceptance of the user plays as much as a role as the actual reliability of the software, because it's unusual for things like the heartbleed bug to occur that affects thousands of applications across the world that almost necessitate the update, as opposed to these relatively minor fixes that you can live without. In fact, at this very moment, both my Firefox and Google browsers, or Chrome browser, are telling me that there are updates available, and I haven't done it. I will tonight, but not today, not this moment. I don't know that I've answered your question, though.
I was reading the comment from John. My Windows 10 machine crashed irrevocably a couple of weeks ago from an optional update.
Alan, you're muted, by the way. We didn't hear you, Alan, in your last statement. Could you...
sorry, I was muted. Yeah, no, I think it's obviously up to the organizations who are developing and deploying the software what choices they make about how to do that. I think my point was just that often with technology, when things and approaches become generally accepted, it almost becomes a default behavior. And so I think often people or organizations might not even consider the implications of a particular approach, because the default behavior is to, say, deliver updates in this particular example, even though that may have various side effects that could be undesirable. So,
yeah, there's also an example with my car. You know, I'll get a message telling me that there's an update available, and that it will automatically apply it at some hour in the middle of the night. And I can stop it, but then it'll be back the next day to ask me again. And the default is that I will run the latest version. And in fact, if you're a vendor, it's in your interest to have everybody running the latest and greatest version of the software, because that's fewer versions for you to have to support. When I was a software vendor, one of the first things our software support team would ask of the customer is, which version are you running? And if they named an older version, the support team would say, you better update the software. And then we'll, so sometimes you have the choice and sometimes you don't. But your point is very well taken, that we're living in a very fluid existence.
Yeah. And there's also, just the last point, there's obviously a linked issue there for the consumer of the software, in that they're effectively consuming something that is frequently changing. And so having almost a legal relationship between what you purchase and what it exists to be in the future becomes rather difficult. And I know the EU, for example, the European Commission is looking at this in a number of areas to see what
the individual users are happy to have the latest version, because they feel that the software vendor is looking out for them and providing them with updates or new features or bug fixes, and that why use yesterday's version when today's version is here.
Yeah.
Matthias, you want to say something? But I think you're on mute. We didn't. No.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Matthias.
Actually, you don't appear on mute on the application, but So
sorry, now
yeah.
it's double mute. Technology rules. So what I wanted to say is it is not always desired by many customers to be on the latest and greatest version, because the latest may not fit their requirements, for example, with respect to certifications, right? There are government standards around the world which require you to freeze a specific version. There are vendors who certify a software only on a very specific status or time snapshot, and otherwise would not support a customer. And as a software vendor, you cannot do anything against that. So there is that is one of the primary challenges currently in the software world. That I think the Gartner analysts have called this mode 1 and mode 2. Fortunately, they went away from that because they realized there is more than just 2 modes. We call it multimodal. So that's the SUSE word, actually, because the organizations live partially in a very old mode and partially in a very aggressive mode. And we have seen that with customers who are extremely conservative, but one day they wanted the most recent version of PHP. Totally absurd request from my perspective, but from their perspective, totally normal. Everything's stable, but just PHP must be 5 years younger than the rest of the stack. That is a challenge that will never go away. The only thing I can say is that for the, and I come back to Edge and IoT, because that's also from an operating system perspective in my domain at SUSE, is that we here go for operating systems which do auto updates. So basically, our testing must be good enough to really have a fully automated update of the operating system stack, and all the applications are delivered as virtual machines or containers, and then have a different testing cycle, obviously also with different vendors potentially available. So that's probably if you can build an abstraction, then the update question becomes easier, at least to a certain degree.
Nice point. I don't know if Peter Valgemode.
Yes, I am available.
Yeah, here you are. Okay. If you would, because he has a question for Matthias, if I'm not wrong, right?
Yeah, yes,
and also be the last question, and then I think we are going to close for today.
Yeah, to Matthias, but I think also to the EU participants from I wonder in what extent the EU and also other continents should invest in an ecosystem for the software supply system services, because I think we need a sustainable model for that, and it might even be more important than where everybody is now focusing on this initial open source part, where everybody believes if that's right, then it will be right. So how do you see also from the European, but also from your experience with SUSE, this development going, and also the focus on this part of the process?
Matthias, I can start if you like. This is a short version.
Please start.
So Europe is investing heavily, at least on the data side, and not just for open. You will hear a lot in the next few years about something called data spaces. Is a new keyword to refer to helping businesses within Europe to share data between them in a way that is technologically sound, legally solid, and using business models that are consolidated and understandable, well communicated to citizens. And a lot of money is going this direction. We are all waiting for the Digital Europe program, for example, to find out how we can use that money for funding, work in this direction. It's just a step away from software to me. I mean, the same could be used that way, and the Digital Europe program probably will create opportunities for that. So keep an eye on it. Matthias, to you.
Yeah. So if I let me rephrase the question if I understand it correctly, Peter. So you were asking whether we should invest into basically build something like a software conservatory. I mean, this already exists on a worldwide basis in Spitzbergen, I think, directly besides the seeds. that may have legal challenges outside of open source, right? I mean, there is the code escrow that many companies have used for decades before open source was becoming more widespread. I know that many companies have used that. With open source, that's obviously easier to do, because you just can have the software, the source code. Either the company stores it themselves. I agree, though, that and that's what I wanted to indicate with my discussion about digital sovereignty, bringing this in context with secure software supply chain and open source, that Europe has obviously an issue with respect to, let me call it a little bit aggressive, ownership. I do not mean, and this is one of the real dangers that please don't misunderstand me here. It's not about ownership in the sense of closing it. And it's also not meant as ownership in the sense of creating a separate universe. There are other parts of the world who may try this or already are building this. Not Europe. We should not go into that trap. So we should keep the openness. Otherwise, everybody will lose, and specifically Europe. But to secure the software, the infrastructure, critical infrastructure, and businesses are running on in a geographically distributed way and also commercially independent way might be extremely wise.
Yeah, this is exactly what I'm looking for. I'm also involved in one of the next generation internet ledger challenges. And what I see, of course, if there will be software, open source software components in this development, which will be key for the whole service stack, basically, which is behind that as well. These are very strategic, and they need to be protected also from continuous development process side, because if they fell out of the system, the whole system will fall down, basically. And what I think what we would need is in this European data space is a protected space, more or less, where we give the software companies this second service support process, which you described, which is provided then also on a big scale and supported on a basically European level of protection. So it should be open, but not be also easy to take away from some sort of intellectual property perspective, but then in a right and a more common type of way of using it. And of course, what I think what we need is, especially now with AI and all these new developments coming up, we really need an extremely good version management system of the software and all the stacks of the software linked to the data. And if we say we will create the European data space, then I think a key component of that service space is exactly this process where you support software companies in releasing their codes, basically, and maintaining that on that, I think, European service side. So because you have to have scale to do that also.
Yeah, it's a good point.
I'm curious how you feel about that.
It gets very difficult to draw a line, isn't it? So most AIs are a combination of the software running knowledge represented in data and training data.
Yes.
Can you really manage one properly and ignoring the other? Can you protect the intellectual property on one side and not doing it on the other? Yes. Can we have legislation helping you on one side and not helping you on the other?
It's a problem.
Yeah.
Great. Sorry for interrupt this nice discussion, but I think you, David, you have.
Yeah, well, it was just on
very short.
Yeah, it was just on that very, very last point from Gianfranco, who mentioned legislation. And I highlighted this in the chat earlier, and it came back to John's point, actually, about automotive. And one of the things in those areas is actually around liability. One of the things that FOSS has still not worked out is how exactly you fulfill liability when, for example, you're using FOSS to launch your $6 billion spacecraft, or you're using it to control you know, every self-driving vehicle, where you've got probably for each one about £5 to £10 million of liability of killing the occupants. You know, there's a lot of how that works. And so though I agree some sort of incubator or something for around open source software is good, I think I would also suggest that the wider parts of the systematic ecosystem need to also be considered and supported. So, you know, so actually, you know, how that sort of thing, how liability has worked and stuff like that is just as important.
We have the same problem on the data side. You can build businesses and you may claim the failure of a business on bad assumption or modeling. The point is, what we have said at least until now, given that legislation may not necessarily create a direct link between liability and the guarantees you get through the license, is that the best temporary solution is to just be incredibly transparent and thorough in documenting the limitations of what you offer, whether it is software or data. Where today we fail is in being very clear about stating the limitations of what we give. So if the data is not well documented, users will think that it's fine, let's try, let's give it a go, and 5 years later it's still there, perhaps underneath an important piece of software in a business of a few million euros. But if we, from the start, we claim this data was created several years ago, it has holes, it's not reliable and so on, then the users will have a good understanding of what they can actually build on top of it, won't protect them from liability, but they will have a better idea of what they can actually, what the risk they can take or not. And this applies identically for software and for data.
Yeah, you do pull out the thing there that actually, you know, the little licensing text that people put on about fitness for purpose and things like that does not protect you from legal liability for a lot of things. Yeah. So there's, you know, that's something that does need to be thought about.
And because these ecosystems will become more and more fragmented and very diverse, not in a bad way, in a good way, we can't really hide behind the finger of liability. Okay, I will use this piece of data or this piece of software only if the license will give me the opportunity to sue them back. That's not really a win.
That would have been exactly my comment. What is the difference to let's say proprietary data or proprietary software there? Because in the end, someone needs to take the step and say, I'm liable. If we believe, and I do so, that software in a certain complexity is not perfect, and I guess that's the case, and then the situation is starting at a certain complexity level, the situation for proprietary and open source software is identical.
If you can be insured, so the liability thing, the end point of liability for all of this is actually insurance. If you can be insured as a developer that's giving the software, for, in my example, to the European Space Agency, then, you know, then essentially you are taking liability for failure of the software or system that you provide. The tricky part is that those insurance companies will take a very long, hard look if you've bought stuff in from outside, particularly FOSS, and go, you know what, we're not paying out, mate. You've got to find the £1 billion. And there goes your company.
I think in many cases, commercial organizations, if they're creating a derivative that's based on FOSS, just sometimes have to assume the liability. And in any case, there's no real scope for them to claim any liability or maybe even warranties from some of the smaller developers who've contributed to the software that they base their derivative on. So it's a difficult problem, I think. That.
Well, and this is why I think one of the things, that rather than the techie side of this, with my, in one of my other hats, I have a very systems approach to energy, and I think a very systems approach to software is the other thing that we need to be thinking about. And we do need to think about those really nice social sciencey legal sides of these as well.
And I would add to that an element of ownership. So I don't think it is no more acceptable that we you know, we used to say in the 80s, you buy from IBM and then you don't worry, right? Because nobody will ever blame you. This does not work anymore. If you use a piece of open data, a piece of open software, you need to take ownership of that. You even suing them, it's not going to take the satellite back in orbit.
Oh no, but it might build a second satellite.
It may pay for a second satellite. Yeah.
Sorry for interrupting you.
Yeah.
If you would in a face-to-face workshop, I would say, so you can discuss offline. I don't know what does it mean here, offline. Probably you can call on your phone. You will see.
We'd have wine now, wouldn't we, Pierre-Luigi?
Yeah. Sorry?
We would have wine now.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That's what we should have had. We should have sent out a little care package.
So thank you very much for everyone. We added half an hour. I know that people has other business to take care, so they reserve more than expected. We will continue tomorrow, so I will invite you to join our sessions. Our session of tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Enjoy your day, night, afternoon, morning, whatever, wherever you are. Thank you very much.